In 1788, a mob tore through the streets of New York because a group of doctors had been quietly digging up graves to study the bodies inside. In 1783, the officers of the Continental Army sat down in a farmhouse in Newburgh, New York, and calmly discussed marching on their own Congress. In the summer of 1816, snow fell across New England in June, crops died in the fields, and thousands of families gave up and walked west rather than face a second year like it. None of that is legend. It is documented, footnoted, and mostly missing from the version of early America you were handed in a classroom. The country you think you know spent its first century closer to falling apart than holding together. Riots, mutinies, a year without a summer, laws written and rewritten to answer questions nobody had settled yet. That is the actual story, and it is stranger than the shortened one. If you like history that stays true to the record without smoothing off the strange parts, consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a tap. Now get comfortable. Settle in, let your eyes close if they want to, and let your mind wander back a long way to a muddy, angry colony on the edge of an ocean in the year 1676. Virginia in 1676 is not a peaceful place. It is a colony of two very different Englands living uneasily next to each other. Along the coast, near the rivers, sit the tidewater planters, men with land, tobacco, and a governor who has run the colony for decades. Inland, along the frontier, are smaller farmers and former servants who finished their contracts and got nothing but rough land at the edge of Indian territory for their trouble. They are exposed in debt and angry, and they believe the colony's leadership in Jamestown does not care whether they live or die. The governor is William Berkeley, and by 1676 he has run Virginia, on and off, for more than 30 years. Berkeley favors a cautious policy toward the region's native nations. He wants trade, not war, partly because trade is profitable for men connected to him. The frontier settlers see it differently. They want protection, and when they don't get it, some of them decide to take matters into their own hands. Underneath the surface, there is also a simple economic problem. Tobacco prices had been sliding for years, taxes were rising to pay for coastal defense, and land close to the rivers was already claimed by the men who had arrived earlier and connected themselves to Berkeley's circle. That left newer arrivals and freed servants pushing further inland, onto land closer to native towns, with less capital and less patience for a governor they felt was more interested in the fur trade than in their safety. That is where Nathaniel Bacon enters the story. Bacon is young, well-connected, a relative by marriage to Berkeley himself, and newly arrived in Virginia with money and ambition. After a series of raids and killings along the frontier, some by settlers, some by native groups defending their own land, Bacon positions himself as the leader the frontier has been waiting for. Berkeley refuses to give him a military commission. Bacon takes one anyway, gathering armed men and marching against native communities regardless of whether they had any connection to the original violence. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, and where a strictly accurate telling has to slow down. Bacon's forces attacked the Occaneechi, who had actually just fought and defeated a hostile group on Virginia's behalf, and then turned on the Occaneechi anyway once the fighting was done. He also moved against the Pamunkey, a nation that had remained largely at peace with the colony. Historians describe this less as a coherent war strategy and more as an indiscriminate campaign, one that treated native identity itself as the target rather than any specific act of aggression. It is not a flattering chapter for Bacon, and it is not treated as one by serious historians. Berkeley declared Bacon a rebel. Bacon, in turn, issued something he called a Declaration of the People, accusing Berkeley of favoritism, unfair taxes, and failing to defend the frontier. Bacon then turned his men toward the colonial government itself. Twice, Berkeley fled Jamestown ahead of him. In September of 1676, Bacon's forces marched into the largely undefended capital and burned it to the ground, rather than let Berkeley's loyalists reoccupy it. For a moment, an armed uprising had effectively driven the royal governor of Virginia out of his own capital, and Virginia had no functioning seat of government at all. It did not last. Only weeks later, Bacon fell ill with dysentery, a common and often fatal condition in the swampy tidewater climate, and died before the year was out. Without its leader, the rebellion collapsed quickly. Some of his remaining followers scattered, and a few reportedly weighted his body and buried it in secret in the river, so it could not be found and put on public display. Berkeley returned to power and responded with a wave of executions, hanging roughly 24 men he identified as ringleaders, in some cases without much resembling a fair trial. He also seized the property of several of the accused for himself. The scale and speed of the hangings alarmed even the government back in England, which was reportedly unhappy that Berkeley had executed so many men before the Crown had a chance to weigh in on their fate. Berkeley was recalled to London to explain himself, and died not long after arriving, his reputation in tatters. King Charles II is said to have remarked that the old man had hanged more people in that small colony than the king himself had executed for the killing of his own father. So who was Nathaniel Bacon? Historians still argue about it, and it is worth saying plainly that neither easy version holds up well. He was not a proto-democrat fighting for the little man against a corrupt elite, though that is how some writers, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, chose to remember him, casting the rebellion as an early flicker of American resistance to distant, unaccountable authority. Later historians pushed back hard on that reading. He also was not simply a villain with no grievance behind him, and Berkeley's own governing style, protective of his allies, slow to defend the frontier, gave the uprising real fuel. He was, in the more careful modern reading, an ambitious, well-born newcomer who channeled genuine frontier grievances about land, about safety, about a distant and self-interested government, into a campaign that also included the killing of native people who had done nothing to provoke it. The evidence supports frustration with Berkeley's rule. It does not support turning Bacon into a folk hero, and most historians today are careful to hold both facts at once rather than pick a side. One detail unsettled Virginia's ruling class more than almost anything else about the whole affair. Bacon's forces were not made up only of poor English settlers. They included indentured servants, and they also included enslaved and free Africans, fighting side by side against the colonial government. For men like Berkeley and the planters around him, that was the real warning sign, proof that poor people of different backgrounds could find common cause against the people who ran the colony. Virginia's lawmakers took note, and over the following decades they set out, through statute after statute, to make sure a coalition like that could never form again. Before Bacon's rebellion, the legal status of Black Virginians was not yet fully settled. Servitude, freedom, and something in between all existed at once, and the law had not yet drawn hard lines between them. One of the clearest examples is a man named Anthony Johnson. Johnson arrived in Virginia around 1621, likely aboard a ship carrying enslaved Africans, and is recorded as working for years under a term of servitude before earning his freedom. By the 1640s, he was farming his own land on Virginia's eastern shore, and by the 1650s, court records show him owning several hundred acres along with servants and at least one enslaved laborer of his own. He successfully brought legal disputes before Virginia courts, and in at least one case, a court ruled in his favor over a white neighbor. His case is well documented specifically because it kept surfacing in colonial court records, and it shows that in the colony's earliest decades, a free black landowner in Virginia with standing to sue and be taken seriously by a court was possible. It does not mean it was common. Most historians are careful to describe Johnson as an exception the surviving records happen to preserve well, not a typical outcome for Africans arriving in Virginia at the time, when most others in similar circumstances left little to no paper trail behind at all. Even in that earlier period, though, the system was not equal, and signs of a coming split show up in the court record well before Bacon ever picked up a musket. In 1640, a Virginia court dealt with 3 servants, 2 of them European and 1 African, named John Punch, who had all run away together and been recaptured. The 2 European servants had time added to their existing contracts. Punch, by contrast, was sentenced to serve his master for the rest of his life. It is one of the earliest documented cases in English North America, where punishment split along these lines, years before slavery had been formally written into Virginia law at all. That blurrier system kept narrowing steadily in the decades that followed. In 1662, the Virginia Assembly passed a statute establishing that the status of a child would follow the status of the mother, a principle later historians would label with the Latin phrase partus sequitur ventrum, meaning that which is brought forth follows the womb. Practically, this meant that a child born to an enslaved mother was enslaved from birth, regardless of the father's status, including in cases where the father was a free Englishman. This broke sharply from English common law tradition, which had generally tied a child's status to the father. The 1662 law made enslavement something that could pass down automatically, generation to generation. 5 years later, in 1667, Virginia's legislature addressed another open question. Some enslaved people had sought baptism into Christianity, and there was genuine uncertainty about whether converting to Christianity might carry an Old English legal expectation of eventual freedom. The 1667 statute closed that door directly, stating plainly that baptism did not alter a person's bondage or freedom. The law said so explicitly, so that the religious status of a person and their legal status as property would be treated as entirely separate questions going forward. These were not the final word. Virginia kept legislating on the subject for decades, defining and redefining who counted as property, who could be punished without trial, and how far an owner's authority extended, in a slow accumulation of statutes rather than one single decisive law. A 1691 statute banned interracial marriage outright and ordered the banishment of any free English subject who married a black or mixed-race partner. Other laws in this stretch restricted the ability of enslaved people to gather in groups, to carry weapons, or to travel without written permission from an owner. What Bacon's rebellion seems to have done, in the eyes of many historians, is sharpen the colony's leadership's sense of urgency. A rebellion where poor English settlers and enslaved and free Africans had fought on the same side was, for men running a plantation economy, a preview of a coalition they very much wanted to prevent from happening again. Tying enslavement more rigidly to race, and separating the interests of poor white Virginians from those of enslaved black Virginians through law and small legal privileges, served that goal whether or not it was the single motivating cause. The process reached something like a final form in 1705, when the Virginia General Assembly consolidated decades of piecemeal statutes into a single, comprehensive code, now generally called the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. The 1705 Code defined enslaved people as real property for most legal purposes, meaning they could be inherited, taxed, and sold as land and livestock were. It restricted enslaved people's movement, their right to assemble, and their ability to testify against a white colonist in court, and it set out separate, harsher punishments for enslaved people than for free colonists committing similar offenses. It also formally restricted the rights of free black Virginians, barring them from holding public office, testifying in most court cases, and owning white indentured servants, narrowing a category of person that men like Anthony Johnson had once, decades earlier, been able to occupy with real land and real legal standing. Other colonies looked to Virginia's code as a model as they wrote and tightened their own laws in the years that followed, and pieces of the framework it laid out would remain part of Virginia law for well over a century. What the 1005 Code represents, in strictly legal terms, is an endpoint. A system that had once been ambiguous enough to allow a formerly enslaved man to become a landowner had been legislated, over the course of roughly 2 generations, into something rigid, comprehensive, and race-based. The statutes exist, they are dated, and historians can trace the process year by year through Virginia's own legislative record. Virginia was not the only colony reshaping its laws and its self-understanding in this period. Up in Massachusetts, the colony was working through a very different kind of legal reckoning, one that had less to do with land and labor and everything to do with fear, testimony, and a set of trials in a small town called Salem that the colony would spend years trying to live down. By the fall of 1692, 19 people had been hanged in Salem, and 1 old man had been crushed under stones. Several more died in jail awaiting trial, in conditions that killed almost as efficiently as the gallows. More than 200 people across Essex County had been formally accused. The trials themselves you already know or think you do. What almost nobody covers is what happened once the colony woke up and had to live with itself. The unraveling started with the evidence itself. The convictions rested heavily on spectral testimony, accusers swearing they were tormented by the invisible shape of the accused, a shape no one else in the room could see. It's the kind of evidence that only works if everyone agrees to believe it works. By October 1692, that agreement was falling apart. Increase Mather, one of the most respected ministers in Massachusetts, wrote that it would be better for 10 suspected witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned, and he said the specters could be the devil borrowing an innocent person's shape without their consent. Governor William Phipps, who had let the special court run for months, suddenly had reason to worry, because his own wife had reportedly been named as a suspect. On October 29, 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. The killing stopped almost as fast as it had started. Phipps replaced it with a new superior court of judicature, and this time the judges were told not to admit spectral testimony. Almost everyone still awaiting trial under the new rules was acquitted. The evidence had not changed. The willingness to believe it had. Then came the harder part, which is admitting you were wrong out loud. 5 years later, in January 1697, the Massachusetts colony held a day of fasting and reflection over what had happened at Salem. In Boston's Old South Church, a minister stood before the congregation and read aloud a written confession while the man who wrote it stood silently in the pews. That man was Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who had sat on the witchcraft court. He did not defend himself. He asked that the guilt be laid on him, and he apparently kept a private day of fasting for the rest of his life on the anniversary as a standing penance. Of the judges involved, he is the only one on record ever expressing public regret. The jury did something similar. 12 men, led by their foreman, Thomas Fisk, signed a statement admitting they had convicted on evidence that was not sufficient, and that they had been, in their own words, deluded by the powers of darkness. They asked forgiveness from anyone they had wronged. It is a strange document to read, ordinary men trying to explain in writing how they had helped kill their neighbors. Even some of the accusers eventually came forward. Ann Putnam Jr. had been one of the original afflicted girls, one of the loudest voices pointing fingers at Salem village. In 1706, 14 years later, she stood in the village church and had a confession read on her behalf, saying she had been deluded by Satan into accusing innocent people, and naming her regret, especially toward Rebecca Nurse, one of the women she had helped send to the gallows. She is, as far as the record shows, the only one of the original accusers who ever apologized in public. The others lived out their lives without leaving a word of regret on paper, at least none that survived. The colony's government eventually tried to fix what could be fixed, which was mostly money and paperwork, because it could not undo the hangings. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed an act reversing the attainders, the legal convictions, against many of those executed, and it awarded roughly £600 in compensation to their families. But the list was incomplete. Several names were left off, some because no descendants came forward to petition on their behalf. Bridget Bishop was one of them, so was Susanna Martin. Their formal legal clearance did not happen until 1957, when Massachusetts passed a resolve addressing the survivors, and even that missed at least one name. The very last person convicted at Salem to be formally exonerated, a woman named Elizabeth Johnson Jr., was not cleared until 2022, after a group of 8th graders in a civics class petitioned the state legislature on her behalf. 330 years is a long time to wait for a not guilty, and it says something about how ordinary bureaucratic neglect can outlast even a colony's public shame. One case never fit neatly into any of this because it never produced a conviction at all. Giles Corey, an 80-something farmer, refused to enter a plea when he was charged. Under English common law at the time, a person who would not plead could not be tried, and a person who was not tried could not be convicted, and a person who was not convicted could not have their property legally seized by the crown. Corey seems to have understood this. So the court applied peine forte et dure, pressing, laying heavy stones on his chest, a little at a time, over 2 days to force a plea out of him. He never gave one. He died under the stones, and by dying silent, he kept his farm in his family's hands. It is one of the only known cases of judicial pressing in American history, and it is a strange kind of victory purchased at the worst possible price. Salem eventually made its peace, on paper, if not entirely in memory. Less than a century later, in a different colony, a different set of dead bodies would tear a city apart, not over accusations of witchcraft, but over what was actually being done to bodies pulled out of the ground in the dark. That story takes us to New York City in the spring of 1788. It's April 1788. New York City is small enough that everyone more or less knows everyone, and word travels through it fast, especially bad news. New York Hospital, downtown, one of the first chartered hospitals in the new nation, trains its medical students the way most hospitals of the era did, by cutting open the dead. The problem is supply. Dissection was widely considered a desecration, close to a second death, something owed only to the worst criminals as an extra layer of punishment. Legal cadavers, mostly the bodies of executed prisoners, were scarce, and a growing medical school needed a steady flow of them. So medical students, sometimes with the tacit blessing of their instructors, turned to grave robbing, sending men out at night to dig up the recently buried and haul them back for the dissecting table. And in New York, as in most cities with this problem, the graves that got robbed were disproportionately the ones nobody with power was watching closely. That meant the Potter's Field, where the poor were buried without much ceremony, and especially what New Yorkers called the Negroes' burial ground, several acres outside the city's northern edge, where free and enslaved black New Yorkers had been laid to rest for generations, since the city's main churchyards largely excluded them. It was, in effect, a burial ground with no one guarding it, and no one in power inclined to start. This was not a secret. In February 1788, a group of free black New Yorkers sent a petition to the city's Common Council, describing what was happening to their dead and asking for some kind of protection for the graves. It was a reasonable, specific request from people who had already buried enough family members without also having to guard the graves afterward. Nothing came of it. No ordinance, no patrol, no consequence for the students or the hospital. The petition simply went nowhere, which is its own kind of answer, and it means that when the city finally did erupt over grave robbing 2 months later, it erupted on behalf of people who had not been the ones asking for help. 2 months later, the spark. The most repeated version of the story involves a young boy peering through a window at the hospital, watching the anatomy work inside, and a medical student inside deciding to have some fun with him, dangling a severed arm or hand toward the glass and telling the boy it belonged to his recently deceased mother. The boy ran home and told his father, who happened to work as a mason. The father went to the cemetery, checked his wife's grave, and found it empty. Word spread through the neighborhood within hours. By the next day, a crowd had formed outside the hospital, then grown into a mob, then grown into something closer to a general uprising against the medical profession itself. The crowd broke into the building, tore through the dissecting rooms, and reportedly found partially dissected remains inside, which did nothing to calm anyone down. Doctors and students who had not already fled were chased through the streets, and some spent the next several days hiding in jail cells, of all places, because a locked cell was safer than an open house. Thousands of New Yorkers took to the streets over the following 2 or 3 days, from mid to late April 1788. The city's ordinary constables and night watch could not control a crowd that size, so the militia was called out, and even prominent men who tried to calm things down got caught in it. Baron von Steuben, the Prussian-born general who had drilled the Continental Army at Valley Forge, tried to talk the crowd down and was struck in the head with a brick for his trouble. John Jay, already one of the most respected figures in the new nation, was injured by a thrown stone while trying to help restore order. Mayor James Duane and Governor George Clinton both turned out personally to try to manage the crowd, which tells you how seriously the city's leadership took the threat. By the time the militia opened fire to finally break up the mob, several people were dead, with estimates of the toll varying by source, somewhere between a handful and a few dozen, along with many more wounded. New York's answer, the following year, was a law rather than an apology. In 1789, the state passed legislation permitting the dissection of the bodies of executed criminals, along with certain unclaimed bodies, an attempt to give anatomists a legal, non-desecrating source of cadavers and take some of the pressure off the graveyards. Nobody passed a law protecting the Negroes' burial ground specifically, and the petition from February 1788 was never revisited in any formal way. The ground itself was eventually built over and forgotten by the city for 2 centuries, until construction crews rediscovered it in 1991 while breaking ground for a federal office building, a find that led to a very different kind of reckoning with the same site generations later. The 1789 law did not fully solve the original problem, and grave robbing for medical schools continued in various forms for decades afterward in New York and everywhere else that trained doctors. This was never a uniquely New York problem. Britain had its own resurrection men working the churchyards around the same period, and every city with a medical school and a shortage of legal bodies faced some version of the same ugly arithmetic. Bodies needed for training, dignity owed to the dead, and nobody quite willing to reconcile the two. 5 years before the mob formed outside New York Hospital, a much larger and much better armed body of angry men had gathered less than 100 miles up the Hudson River, and their grievance was not about the dead. It was about not being paid for staying alive through a war. It's March 1783. The war is effectively over, though nobody in camp has said so officially yet, and that unofficial silence is part of the problem. The Continental Army is encamped at Newburgh, New York, along the Hudson, several thousand men strong, and it has been sitting there for months with very little to do but think about what comes next. Preliminary articles of peace with Britain had already been signed the previous fall, so everyone in camp knows the fighting is effectively finished. What comes next, as far as anyone can tell, is disbandment, the army simply dissolving once the final treaty is signed. For the officers, that is a frightening prospect, because Congress had promised many of them pensions back in 1780, roughly half pay for life, and Congress does not actually have reliable money to pay for anything. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government has no power to tax directly. The individual states are supposed to fund it through voluntary requisitions, and the states are not exactly rushing to send cash to Philadelphia. Years of unpaid wages sit behind the officers too, along with unpaid wages owed to the enlisted men under them. Peace, for this army, looks less like relief and more like abandonment, a war won and then quietly walked away from by the government it had been fighting for. Into that mood drops an anonymous letter, circulated through camp in early March, urging the officers to meet and consider more forceful measures if their demands were not met before the army disbanded and lost its only leverage. It is eloquent, angry writing, the kind that assumes its readers already agree with it and only needs to give them permission to act. It called for a meeting of officers the following day, without waiting for Washington's approval, which was itself a break from how the army normally did business. Historians now generally attribute the writing to Major John Armstrong, Jr., an aide on the staff of General Horatio Gates, though the letter itself was unsigned and circulated as though it spoke for the officer corps as a whole. What remains genuinely uncertain, and historians still argue about it, is how far the scheming went beyond one aide's pen. Some officers connected to nationalist figures in Congress, men like Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton, wanted a stronger federal government with real power to tax, and an angry, unpaid army was useful leverage for that argument, whether or not anyone intended things to go as far as actual mutiny. Gates's circle is suspected of involvement in encouraging the address. Gouverneur Morris is sometimes named in the same conversation. The evidence for a coordinated plot to use the army as a battering ram against Congress is suggestive rather than conclusive, and the honest answer is that nobody has ever fully settled how deliberate, or how dangerous the scheme actually was. Whatever the machinery behind it, the officers scheduled a meeting for March 15th, after Washington intervened to postpone the original date and redirect it under his own nominal authority, rather than let it happen entirely outside his control. General Washington, who was not expected to attend in person, walked in anyway. He had not planned to speak long. He asked the officers to trust that Congress would act justly if given time, and to reject the anonymous address as a step that would stain the honor they had earned over 8 years of war. Partway through reading a supporting letter from a congressman, he stumbled over the text and reached for a pair of spectacles most of the men in the room had never seen him wear in public. He apologized for the delay, saying something to the effect that he had grown gray in their service and now found himself growing blind. The line is well attested across multiple accounts from officers present that day, and by most tellings it did more work than the rest of the speech combined. Grown men who had marched through Valley Forge together reportedly wept. Washington left the room. The officers, without him present, passed resolutions of their own, expressing disgust at the anonymous address and reaffirming their confidence that Congress would treat them fairly. The moment, whatever it had been building toward, dissolved into loyalty on paper. How close this actually came to something more serious than a strongly worded petition is genuinely contested among historians. Some read it as the nearest thing to a military coup in American history, a moment where the survival of civilian government hinged on one man's willingness to walk into a room. Others read it as a tense but ultimately manageable grievance, amplified in hindsight because Washington's intervention made for such a tidy, dramatic story. Both readings agree on the facts of the meeting. They disagree on how much danger the Republic was actually in. Congress and the Army did eventually settle something. Later that same month, Congress voted to commute the officers' promised lifetime pensions into a lump sum equal to 5 years of full pay, which was on paper, progress. In practice, that payment came late, arrived in devalued paper certificates rather than hard currency, and left plenty of officers and enlisted men feeling like the debt owed to them had been settled mostly in appearance. The Army disbanded later that year with much of what it was owed still unresolved in any way that put real money in anyone's pocket. The soldiers went home unsettled, underpaid, and, in more than a few cases, still owed money for their service years later. 3 years after Newburgh, in the hill country of western Massachusetts, some of those same veterans, now farmers again, would pick up their muskets over debts and unpaid wages of a different kind, and this time there would be no general with spectacles to talk them down. It's 1786. The war is over, independence is won, and Massachusetts is broke. Not the state government exactly, though that's broke too. The people, farmers across the western counties, men who fought at Bunker Hill and Saratoga and Yorktown, are coming home to find their own government is the one about to take their farms. Here's the problem. Massachusetts owes a fortune in war debt, much of it held by wealthy investors and speculators along the coast, in Boston and Springfield. To pay it off, the state legislature raises taxes, and it insists those taxes be paid in hard currency. Gold or silver, specie it was called. Not paper money, not goods, not labor, not the barter credit that rural New England had run on for generations. Specie that almost nobody in the farm country actually has. So the farmers do what people without cash have always done. They borrow, and when they can't pay back the loans, the county courts do their job. They foreclose, they seize land, they send men to debtors' prison, sometimes over debts of just a few dollars. Historians looking at the court dockets from these years describe some western counties as dominated by debt cases, farm after farm listed for auction. The people affected are not strangers to organizing. Many of them are Continental Army veterans, men who know how to muster, how to march, how to make a crowd feel like a formation just by standing in one. Starting in the late summer of 1786, armed groups start showing up at county courthouses. Not to burn them down, just to stand outside, in ranks, until the judges inside decide there will be no court session that day. If there's no court, there's no foreclosure ruling. It's a blunt tool, and for a while it works. The man whose name ends up attached to this movement is Daniel Shays, a farmer from Pelham and a former Continental Army captain, wounded at Saratoga. He never really wanted the job. He's one leader among several, not obviously the most important one, and he'd say as much himself later. But newspapers need a name, and Shays Rebellion is easier to print than a list of 24 county captains. So the name sticks, fairly or not. By January of 1787, the protest has hardened into something closer to an armed uprising. A force of roughly 1,500 men, poorly supplied and poorly armed, moves on the federal arsenal at Springfield, hoping to seize the weapons stored there. Waiting for them is a state militia force under General William Shepherd, backed by artillery. When the rebels advance, Shepherd's cannons fire, first as a warning over their heads, then into the column itself. 4 men die, the rest scatter into the snow. It's a small battle by any military standard, but it's the moment the crisis becomes impossible to ignore. Massachusetts still needs to finish the job, chase down the scattered rebel bands before spring lets them regroup. The problem, again, is money. The Confederation Congress, the loose union of states still operating under the Articles of Confederation, has no power to tax and no funds to send. So a group of private Boston merchants, worried about their own investments as much as anything else, put up the cash themselves to field an army under General Benjamin Lincoln. Sit with that for a moment. The suppression of an armed uprising against a state government was privately financed, because the national government of the United States could not afford to respond to a crisis happening inside its own borders. Lincoln's army chases the remaining rebels through a brutal winter, and by February the rebellion has essentially dissolved. There's no dramatic final battle, Men just go home or flee to Vermont and New York, which weren't reliably enforcing extradition at the time. A handful of leaders are convicted and sentenced to death. Almost none of those sentences are carried out. Massachusetts, wanting the crisis to end rather than fester, issues a broad pardon. Daniel Shays himself is pardoned in 1788. The following year, John Hancock, running partly on a platform of leniency and reconciliation, is elected governor, having quietly signaled all along that he'd go easy on the rebels. So the rebellion fails on its own terms. Nobody keeps their farm because of it, not directly. But it succeeds at something its leaders may never have intended. It frightens the entire political class of the young United States. George Washington, retired at Mount Vernon, and privately alarmed, writes to his correspondents asking what in the name of heaven is going on in Massachusetts, and whether the Union itself might be coming apart before it's properly begun. Henry Knox sends him reports, some of them exaggerated, of rebel numbers that only deepen the worry. For men like Washington and Madison, who already suspected the Articles of Confederation were too weak to hold the country together, Shays Rebellion becomes the argument they needed. A government that can't raise an army to defend a state, that has to pass the hat to Boston merchants, is not a government built to last. Not everyone reacts with alarm. Thomas Jefferson, serving as minister to France and watching from Paris, takes it almost philosophically, writing that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and comparing it to a storm in the atmosphere. It's a strikingly relaxed take, and it says something about how differently the crisis looked from an ocean away versus from a farmhouse window in western Massachusetts. Within months, delegates are gathering in Philadelphia, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation. They end up writing an entirely new constitution instead, one with the power to tax, to raise an army, to put down exactly this kind of uprising without needing to beg Boston's merchants for a loan. Shays' Rebellion didn't cause the Constitutional Convention on its own, but historians struggle to find a single event that pushed harder. The new federal government would get its own test soon enough. Only a few years later, a different tax on a different frontier would bring angry farmers into the streets again. This time the president wouldn't be writing worried letters from Mount Vernon. He'd be riding out to meet the army himself. It's 1791. The new federal government, barely 2 years old, needs money, and Alexander Hamilton has a plan for that too. Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, wants the federal government to pay off not just its own war debts, but the debts individual states ran up during the Revolution. It's an ambitious, expensive plan, and to help fund it, he pushes an excise tax through Congress, a tax on spirits distilled inside the United States. On paper, it looks like a modest, sensible way to raise revenue. In the hill country of western Pennsylvania, it looks like something else entirely. Out past the Appalachians, in places like Washington and Allegheny counties, farmers grow grain, mostly corn and rye. The trouble is getting it to market. Roads west of the mountains are barely roads at all, and hauling raw grain over them to eastern cities isn't worth the effort. But distill that grain into whiskey, and you have something compact, durable, and valuable enough to justify the trip. Whiskey isn't a luxury out there. It's the one practical cash crop, sometimes used as currency in local trade in place of coin. A federal tax on whiskey, then, isn't really a tax on drinking. It's a tax on the one thing that lets a subsistence farmer touch the cash economy at all. And the way the law is written, the burden falls hardest on the smallest producers, since larger distillers qualify for better rates. The response starts small and gets uglier. Tax collectors sent into the region are threatened, and in a number of documented cases, tarred and feathered, a brutal and deliberately humiliating punishment meant to warn off the next collector who shows up. This isn't new behavior either. Some of these same crowds had done the same thing to British customs officers 20 years earlier, and they know exactly what the ritual is supposed to communicate. Local groups modeled loosely on the committees of the Revolution start meeting, including a notable series of gatherings at Mingo Creek, to coordinate resistance and lean on anyone who cooperates with federal tax officials. Men who resist the resistance, so to speak, and pay the tax anyway, find their barns burned or their stills sabotaged. By the early 1790s, federal officials in the region privately admit the excise is essentially uncollectible west of the mountains without an armed escort, and even that isn't reliably safe. The crisis comes to a head in the summer of 1794. Word spreads that a federal marshal is serving writs against distillers who haven't paid, and an armed crowd, reportedly several hundred strong, marches on the home of John Neville, a wealthy local excise inspector, at his estate called Bower Hill. There's an exchange of gunfire. Enslaved workers and a small detachment of soldiers defend the house at first, and in the fighting several attackers are wounded and one of the rebel leaders is killed. Neville's house is eventually burned to the ground. It's the most serious violence of the entire episode. From there, things escalate fast, at least in appearance. In early August, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 armed men, by various estimates, gather at Braddock's Field outside Pittsburgh, ostensibly for an organized muster and a show of force against federal authority. Some carry a banner with 6 stripes, one for each county involved, a homemade flag for a homemade rebellion. There's fiery talk of marching on Pittsburgh itself, maybe further. Cooler heads, including a young Pennsylvania politician named Albert Gallatin, argue for restraint at these gatherings, and the crowd ultimately marches through Pittsburgh without burning it, which in hindsight looks like the moment the uprising's momentum starts to break. Still, it's the closest the young republic comes to a full regional revolt against a federal law. Washington's response is deliberate, and in hindsight almost theatrical, in how it combines restraint with an overwhelming show of strength. He first tries negotiation, sending commissioners west to talk with the rebels. When that fails to produce a clear surrender, he does something no American president has done before or since. He invokes the Militia Act, calls up roughly 13,000 troops from 4 states, and personally rides out with the army as it marches toward western Pennsylvania. For a stretch of that march, the sitting President of the United States is physically present with troops in the field, reviewing the ranks himself before handing command over to Light Horse Harry Lee for the actual advance into the region. And then, almost anticlimactically, nothing happens. By the time the army arrives, the rebellion has essentially evaporated. There's no battle, no siege, no dramatic confrontation. The men who gathered at Braddock's Field have mostly gone home, melted back into the countryside, or simply decided that facing 13,000 federal troops wasn't worth it. The army rounds up a small number of suspected ringleaders and marches roughly 20 of them east to Philadelphia, in what's remembered as a grim winter procession, some of them paraded partly as a public demonstration of federal power. Of those eventually tried, only 2 are convicted of treason, and Washington pardons both of them. So what did the Whiskey Rebellion actually prove? Historians still argue about how to weigh it. On one hand, it's a genuine landmark. It's the first major test of whether the new federal government could enforce its own laws inside its own borders, and the government passed that test decisively, without a shot fired against the main army. On the other hand, it took 13,000 soldiers and the personal presence of the president to collect a tax from a few thousand farmers who had mostly stopped resisting before the army even arrived. That's not obviously a sign of a government operating from strength. It's also evidence of a government that could only prove its authority by bringing overwhelming force to bear on people who posed, in the end, a fairly limited threat. The excise tax itself would be repealed a few years later. Under Jefferson, a quiet concession that maybe Western Pennsylvania had a point. But 1794 wasn't the only emergency the young capital faced in these years. The year before, while Hamilton and the government were still finding their footing, the city Washington and his cabinet actually worked in, Philadelphia, was fighting something no army could push back. A disease nobody understood was moving through the streets, and by the time it was over, the government itself would have to flee its own capital. It's August of 1793, and Philadelphia, the largest city in the United States and the seat of the young federal government, is dying by the hundreds. The disease arrives quietly enough. A few unexplained deaths near the waterfront in early August, then a few more, then a pattern doctors can't ignore. Within weeks it's clear the city is in the grip of yellow fever, a disease that brings high fever, a jaundice that turns the skin a sickly yellow, and in severe cases, catastrophic internal bleeding. By the time the outbreak burns out in November, historians' best estimates put the death toll at somewhere around 5,000 people, in a city of only about 50,000. Roughly 1 in 10, and that's just the dead. Something like 20,000 more residents, whoever had the money and the means, simply left, emptying entire neighborhoods and turning Philadelphia's streets into something close to a ghost town. The federal government, still headquartered in Philadelphia in these years before Washington, D.C. existed, doesn't escape the panic. George Washington leaves for Mount Vernon once it's clear the outbreak isn't slowing, conducting government business by letter rather than risk the capital. Alexander Hamilton stays behind for a while and contracts the fever himself, a serious and frightening illness for a man in his position, though he recovers. Much of the rest of the government's business simply stops. Its people scattered across the countryside in temporary lodgings, an entire national government functionally paused because nobody had any real idea how to stop a plague from moving through a capital city. Nobody did, really. The dominant medical theory of the day, championed loudest by Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the most respected physicians in the country and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, held that the fever could be treated with aggressive bleeding and purging, draining blood from patients and inducing vomiting and diarrhea to, in the thinking of the time, rid the body of corrupted matter. Rush treated patients with real conviction and real courage, staying in the city through the worst of it when many of his colleagues fled, and seeing dozens of patients a day at the height of the crisis. But historians looking back, including a number of his own contemporaries at the time, generally agree his treatment was almost certainly harmful, weakening already sick patients rather than helping them. Other physicians in the city, including a French refugee doctor named Jean Devez, working out of a hastily organized fever hospital at Bush Hill, argued instead for gentler supportive care, rest, fluids, and mild remedies rather than aggressive bleeding. The two camps argued in print for months, each convinced the other's patients were dying faster, and the dispute outlasted the epidemic itself. A number of Philadelphia's own physicians died treating patients that autumn, a reminder that nobody, however confident their theory, actually understood what they were fighting. With so much of the ordinary machinery of city government scattered or dead, Philadelphia's mayor, Matthew Clarkson, ends up organizing an emergency citizens committee to keep basic services running, arranging for the sick to be moved to the hospital at Bush Hill, for orphaned children to be housed, and for the dead to be collected and buried before they became a hazard themselves. It's a strikingly ad hoc arrangement, private citizens essentially running crisis management for the nation's capital because there was no other body position to do it. A wealthy French immigrant merchant named Stephen Girard was among the volunteers who threw themselves into managing the fever hospital directly, at real personal risk. Into this chaos steps the Free African Society, an organization founded a few years earlier by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, two black religious and community leaders in Philadelphia. At the request of city officials, who were desperate for anyone willing to nurse the sick and bury the dead, the society organized its members to do exactly that work, going door to door through the worst-hit neighborhoods. Part of the reasoning behind the request rested on a belief, widely held at the time and completely mistaken, that black Philadelphians were somehow immune to yellow fever. They weren't. Members of the Free African Society died of the disease at rates roughly comparable to the rest of the city, even as they kept doing the work almost nobody else was willing to do. And then, after all that, they were blamed for it. The Philadelphia publisher Matthew Carey wrote an account of the epidemic that became widely read, and in it he suggested black nurses and caretakers had profited from the crisis, overcharging desperate families and in some cases behaving little better than opportunists. Jones and Allen weren't willing to let that stand. In 1794, they published their own pamphlet, a direct and detailed rebuttal, laying out exactly what their community had done during the epidemic, the risks they took, the people they buried, the deaths among their own members, and answering Carey's accusations point by point. It's considered one of the earliest published protest works by black authors in American history, written not as abstract argument, but as a documented record, correcting the story while the people who lived it were still alive to tell it themselves. The epidemic ends the way most yellow fever outbreaks of the era did, not through any medical breakthrough, but with the first hard frost of the season, which arrived in Philadelphia that November. Nobody at the time understood why cold weather stopped the disease, because nobody understood the actual cause. It would take more than 100 years until the work of Walter Reed and others around 1900, before doctors identified that yellow fever spreads through mosquitoes, not through bad air or contaminated surfaces, which is exactly what a hard frost kills off. In 1793, the best doctors in the country were arguing over bloodletting theories while the actual cause of everything they were fighting was breeding in stagnant water a few streets away. Philadelphia's epidemic wasn't the young republic's only brush with a crisis nobody in the government could fully control. Within just a couple of years, the United States would find itself edging toward a very different kind of emergency. An undeclared war fought at sea against France, with American ships and American sailors caught in the middle of a fight nobody in Philadelphia had planned for. It's 1797. American ships keep leaving port and not coming back, or coming back a lot lighter than they left. France is furious about the Jay Treaty, the deal Washington's administration signed with Britain in 1794 to settle old grievances and keep the peace. France reads it as the United States picking a side, and the side isn't France's. So French privateers and warships start seizing American merchant vessels in the Caribbean and the Atlantic, and by some counts, hundreds of ships get taken inside a couple of years. Cargo gone, crews stranded, no formal declaration of anything. Just ships disappearing off the manifest. John Adams, newly president, tries diplomacy first, which is the boring and sensible option, and therefore rarely how these stories go. He sends 3 commissioners to Paris in 1797, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry. Their job is simple on paper. Meet with a French foreign minister, Talleyrand, and work out a settlement. What actually happens is that Talleyrand doesn't meet with them directly. Instead, he sends intermediaries, 3 of them, who deliver a very specific message. Before any negotiations can begin, the United States needs to apologize for some of Adams's public remarks, extend a large loan to France, and hand over a personal bribe to the minister himself. That's the price of a meeting, not the price of a treaty. The price of getting in the room. The Americans decline, and Marshall writes it all up in dispatches home. When Adams shares the correspondence with Congress in 1798, the names of the French intermediaries are redacted and replaced with letters W, X, Y, and Z. The public devours it anyway. It becomes the XYZ affair, and the reaction is less diplomatic outrage and more raw insult, the sense of a nation being shaken down like a shopkeeper facing a protection racket. One line gets attached to the episode forever. Something like millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. The exact phrasing is likely a slight polish of something a congressman said afterward, rather than a verbatim quote from Pinckney himself. But the sentiment was real, and it was everywhere. Songs get written about it. Young men start wearing black cockades on their hats as a show of anti-French, pro-administration feeling, and for a while it becomes almost fashionable to be furious. Congress rides that fury into a burst of legislation. Along with the naval buildup, lawmakers authorize a provisional army, thousands of men on paper, with George Washington coaxed out of retirement to serve as its nominal commander, though the real day-to-day authority sits with his ambitious second-in-command, Alexander Hamilton. The army mostly stays a paper army. It never fights anyone. But the fact that it existed at all, funded and staffed in a moment of national panic, tells you how far the fear had traveled beyond the water. Congress responds fast, in the way legislatures only move when they're angry. In the spring of 1798, they create an entirely new cabinet department, the Department of the Navy, because up to that point the fledgling American fleet had been managed as an afterthought inside the War Department. Benjamin Stoddert becomes the first secretary and starts building a fighting navy almost from scratch, commissioning frigates that had mostly existed as half-finished hulls or theoretical budget lines. And then the fighting starts, for real, without Congress ever voting a formal declaration of war. Historians call what follows the Quasi-War, which is a strange label for something that got people genuinely killed. American frigates hunt French privateers and warships through the Caribbean for 2 years. The most famous engagement comes in February 1799, when the USS Constellation, under Captain Thomas Truxton, catches the French frigate L'Insurgente off Nevis and beats her into submission in under an hour, killing dozens of her crew and losing almost none of his own. A year later, the Constellation tangles with a larger French frigate, La Vengeance, in a nighttime battle that runs for hours, both ships badly torn up before it ends, La Vengeance limping away in the dark rather than surrendering outright. Dozens of smaller actions happen too, privateers against privateers, merchant captains arming their own crews, Small fights in warm water that never made it into any history book chapter titled War. None of it gets a war declaration. All of it gets people buried. Here's the part that split Adams from his own party. By 1799, most of the men around him, the so-called High Federalists led in spirit by Alexander Hamilton, want to keep escalating, maybe even push toward a full declared war with France, while building up a larger standing army at home. Adams looks at the situation differently. He sends a second peace mission to Paris, against the explicit wishes of most of his own cabinet, some of whom he later discovers have been quietly reporting to Hamilton behind his back. It's a lonely, stubborn decision, and it works. By the time the American commissioners arrive, Napoleon Bonaparte has seized power in France as first consul, and Napoleon, for his own reasons, wants the drain on his navy to stop too. The result is the Convention of 1800, signed at a chateau outside Paris called Mortefontaine, which ends the Quasi-War, cancels the old French alliance treaties from the Revolution, and lets both sides walk away without ever having called it a war in the first place. Adams paid for this. Hamilton's faction never forgave him for choosing peace over escalation, and the Federalist Party fractured right as it headed into the 1800 election, a wound it never really closed. But Adams himself, later in life, considered the peace mission the proudest achievement of his presidency. He reportedly wanted it carved on his tombstone, that he had taken the peace with France upon himself in 1800, even knowing what it cost him politically. He got the peace, he lost the party. History has generally decided he was right. None of this happened in a calm country. It happened in a country that was frightened, insulted, and increasingly willing to hand its own government new powers to root out enemies, foreign and domestic. And Congress, in that same anxious summer of 1798, was busy passing laws about exactly that. 4 laws passed through Congress in the summer of 1798, all inside about 10 weeks, all justified by the same fear that had just produced the Quasi-War. France feels like a real threat. French sympathizers, immigrant radicals, and opposition newspapers feel, to the party in power, like an extension of that threat sitting inside the country's own borders. So the Federalist Congress writes legislation aimed at both. It is worth sitting with how fast this happened. 10 weeks from a diplomatic insult to 4 new federal laws touching immigration, deportation, and the press, passed by a legislature that genuinely believed, correctly or not, that a foreign war might be days away. Fear tends to move faster through a legislature than caution does, and 1798 is a fairly clean example of that. The Naturalization Act stretches the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 years to 14, a direct shot at recent immigrants, many of them Irish and French, who tended to vote for Jefferson's opposition party once naturalized. The Alien Friends Act gives the president the power to deport any non-citizen he judges dangerous. No trial required, no evidence presented to a court, just the president's own judgment that a person was a threat. In practice, Adams never actually used this one to deport anyone, though the mere existence of the power was enough to send a wave of French immigrants quietly out of the country on their own before it could be tested. The Alien Enemies Act allows the detention or removal of citizens of a hostile nation during a declared war, a law written for a moment like the Quasi-War and, worth noting plainly, one that has never been repealed and technically remains on the books today, still part of federal law more than 2 centuries later. And then the Sedition Act, the one that reaches past non-citizens entirely, makes it a federal crime to write, print, or say anything false, scandalous, or malicious about the president or Congress with intent to bring them into disrepute. Notably, it did not cover the vice president, which happened to be Jefferson at the time, a detail his opponents were not thrilled about. That last one gets used almost exclusively against one kind of person, opposition editors and printers, the pamphlet and newspaper class of the 1790s. Roughly 25 people get arrested under it, and somewhere between 10 and 14 convictions follow, and the pattern is not subtle. Nearly every target is a journalist aligned against the Adams administration, prosecuted by Federalist attorneys in front of Federalist judges, in a press environment where nearly every paper openly declared its party loyalty on the front page. Benjamin Franklin Bache, grandson of Benjamin Franklin and editor of the fiercely anti-Federalist Aurora newspaper in Philadelphia, gets arrested under the act, but never faces trial. He catches yellow fever in the epidemic that keeps sweeping the city and dies before his case reaches court. one more casualty of a disease that had already reshaped the decade once. Thomas Cooper, an English-born writer and eventual scientist, is convicted and jailed for criticizing atoms in print, and loses a fair amount of money in the process too. The fines were not symbolic. James Callender, a pamphleteer with a talent for finding trouble in every direction, gets convicted too, largely for calling Adams a hypocrite and a warmonger, though Callender would go on to cause plenty of chaos for Jefferson's side of the aisle as well in later years, once Jefferson himself was president and no longer in the mood to reward him. The strangest case belongs to Matthew Lyon, a sitting congressman from Vermont. Lyon is convicted under the Sedition Act for a letter accusing Adams of a, quote, unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp. He gets sentenced to 4 months in jail and a fine. While he's sitting in a cold Vermont cell, in the dead of a New England winter, his district re-elects him to Congress anyway, a fairly direct message from his constituents about what they thought of the law that put him there. Supporters reportedly raised money to cover his fine, faster than the government could process it. He came out of jail and went straight back to Philadelphia to take his seat. One lawmaker among a handful of others who found the whole ordeal did their political career no lasting harm at all. The response from Jefferson and Madison, both watching from outside the administration, is careful and deniable. Jefferson was vice president at the time, which made public authorship of an attack on the sitting government an especially delicate thing to admit to, working in secret without publicly attaching their names. Jefferson drafts a set of resolutions passed by the Kentucky legislature, and Madison drafts a companion set passed by Virginia's, both arguing that the Alien and Sedition Acts exceed the federal government's constitutional authority, and that states have some role in judging when Congress has overstepped. The resolutions are deliberately vague about what states are supposed to actually do about it, and historians still argue about how far Jefferson and Madison meant to go, whether this was a statement of principle meant to rally opposition voters ahead of the next election, or something closer to an actual blueprint for state defiance. What's clear is that later generations in later and much darker disputes over states and federal power would reach back for these resolutions and stretch them well past anything their authors spelled out, or in some cases would likely have endorsed at all. The Sedition Act carried its own expiration date written into the bill, and it lapsed on March 3, 1801, the final day of John Adams's presidency, timed almost exactly to outlast the man who signed it. Jefferson, once in office, pardoned everyone still serving time under it, and Congress eventually repaid many of the fines, a quiet epilogue to a law that had in the end lasted barely 2.5 years. The law was gone. The election that unseated Adams, the one that made all of this suddenly moot, was not so easily settled. It's February 1801, and the United States government does not yet know who its next president will be, 2 weeks before that president is supposed to take office. Here's a design flaw nobody noticed until it nearly broke the country. Under the original Constitution, each presidential elector cast 2 votes for president, full stop. No separate ballot line for vice president. Whoever finished second in the count simply became vice president, which is how you'd ended up with a president and vice president from opposing camps in 1796. By 1800, political parties had figured out how to organize their electors more tightly, which solved one problem and created a much stranger one. The Democratic Republicans intend for Thomas Jefferson to be president and Aaron Burr to be vice president. Their electors are supposed to vote for both men, but with one elector holding back a single vote for Burr, so Jefferson finishes on top. That coordination fails. Every Republican elector votes for both men equally, and Jefferson and Burr finish tied at 73 electoral votes each. Adams and his running mate Charles Cotesworth Pinckney trail behind. Under the Constitution as written, a tie for the top spot sends the decision to the House of Representatives, voting not as individuals but as 16 state delegations, each state getting a single collective vote. Burr, at this point, has an opening, and he doesn't close it. He never publicly renounces the presidency in favor of Jefferson, which was the obviously honorable move given the ticket's clear intent, and his silence lets outgoing Federalist congressmen consider throwing their support behind him instead, mostly out of spite toward Jefferson. It's a strange kind of quiet on Burr's part, not a denial, not an acceptance, just enough ambiguity to keep the whole Capitol guessing about what he actually wanted. The House convenes in February 1801, inside a Washington city that is still mostly mud, half-built government buildings, and boarding houses standing between empty lots where the plan called for a city someday. Congress starts voting. 9 states are needed to win. The first ballot produces 8 for Jefferson, 6 for Burr, 2 delegations split down the middle and casting no vote at all. Nobody moves, they keep voting. Ballot after ballot, the same numbers roughly for 6 straight days, congressmen sleeping on cots near the chamber so they don't miss a call to order. Rumors start circulating that Virginia and Pennsylvania might call out their state militias if Federalists try to force Burr into the presidency or leave the country without an executive past Inauguration Day, which was legally set for March 4. Nobody can say for certain how serious those rumors were, but they were serious enough that people in the Capitol repeated them without laughing. There's also real talk, not fringe chatter, but discussion among sitting congressmen, of passing a statute to hand temporary executive power to the Senate's president pro tempore or the Secretary of State if the House simply can't produce a winner in time. The country is, in a real sense, drifting toward the edge of a constitutional cliff with no railing installed yet, a little more than a decade into the whole experiment. Alexander Hamilton, sidelined from office but still deeply wired into Federalist politics, spends this stretch writing furious letters to anyone who will read them. He despises Jefferson's politics, genuinely. The two men had been rivals for a decade by this point, but he considers Burr something worse, a man of no fixed principle at all, dangerous precisely because nobody could predict what he'd do with power once he had it. Between a rival with a clear philosophy and a man Hamilton trusted with nothing, Hamilton chose the rival. Hamilton pushes his fellow Federalists hard toward accepting Jefferson as the lesser risk. It's not a popular position inside his own party in the moment, but Hamilton keeps pressing it anyway, letter after letter, through a stretch of days when the outcome still felt genuinely uncertain. The break finally comes from James Bayard, the lone congressman representing the state of Delaware, which meant his single vote decided his entire state's position, all by itself. Bayard had been voting for Burr through the deadlock, but by the 36th ballot 6 days in, with no resolution in sight and quiet assurances, reportedly passed along about how a Jefferson administration would treat certain Federalist interests, such as the public debt and the young Navy, Bayard changes his approach. He cast a blank ballot rather than voting for Burr, and enough other Federalists in closely divided delegations do the same, or simply abstain, leaving the room just enough space for Jefferson supporters to finally carry a majority of state votes. The deadlock breaks. Jefferson wins 10 states to 4, with 2 delegations abstaining entirely. It is February 17, 1801, just over 2 weeks before the constitutionally mandated inauguration date, and the country has, barely, avoided finding out what would have happened if it hadn't worked out. 6 days of ballots for an answer that, in hindsight, feels almost inevitable, and did not feel that way at all to the people sitting through it. Congress fixes the mechanical flaw a few years later. The 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804, requires electors to cast separate, clearly labeled votes for president and vice president, which sounds like an obvious fix because it was, and which nobody had bothered to write into the original document, because nobody had anticipated organized political parties fighting quite this hard over the office. What happened in February 1801 gets remembered, when it's remembered at all, as the first peaceful transfer of power between 2 genuinely opposing political parties in American history, a milestone people like to say with confidence years later. Fewer people mention how close it came to not being peaceful at all. Jefferson took office, the Republic held, and almost immediately, his young Navy, the one built in the panic of the Quasi-War, found itself with a new enemy across the Atlantic, this time along the Mediterranean coast of North Africa. For 200 years, American merchant ships sailing the Mediterranean had one thing going for them that had nothing to do with the ships themselves. They flew a British flag, or at least British protection, and the Barbary states of North Africa mostly left British subjects alone. Then independence happened, and that protection evaporated overnight. Suddenly, the United States had a merchant fleet and no navy worth mentioning, sailing into waters patrolled by Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco, 4 semi-independent regencies that had spent generations funding themselves by taking ships, cargo, and crews and selling the arrangement back to whichever country wanted its people returned. The polite word for this was tribute, the honest word was extortion, paid on a schedule, in cash, with treaties to make it official. And it was not a rounding error. Through the 1790s, tribute and ransom to the Barbary states are estimated to have eaten somewhere close to a fifth of the entire federal budget of a country that did not have much of a budget to begin with. That is not a typo. A young nation that had just fought a revolution to stop paying a distant power on demand spent the next decade paying 4 other powers on demand because it was cheaper than building a navy and losing more ships. The 1795 treaty with Algiers set the pattern. The United States paid roughly $1 million, a staggering sum at the time, to ransom over 100 American sailors who had been held captive for years, some of them for a decade, and to buy an annual tribute arrangement going forward. A year later came the Treaty of Tripoli, which contains the line historians and internet commenters both love to quote, the one stating that the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. It is a real clause in the English version ratified by the Senate in 1797. What gets left out of the argument is that the surviving Arabic text of the treaty does not clearly contain an equivalent passage, and scholars still debate how that article got there and what to make of the mismatch. Use the quote if you like, just know the ground under it is softer than people assume. Peace, such as it was, did not last. In 1801, the ruler of Tripoli, unhappy with his cut of the tribute money compared to what Algiers was getting, declared war on the United States in the most Tripoli way imaginable. He had his soldiers chop down the flagpole outside the American consulate. No formal declaration, no letter, just an axe and a flagpole hitting the ground. Thomas Jefferson, recently inaugurated and no fan of paying blackmail to foreign potentates, sent naval squadrons across the Atlantic instead of a check. It did not go smoothly at first. In 1803, the frigate Philadelphia ran aground on an uncharted reef just outside Tripoli harbor, and its crew of over 300 men were captured along with the ship itself, which the Tripolitans began refitting as their own warship. Stephen Decatur fixed that problem in February 1804 with a night raid that has become one of the more cinematic episodes in early American naval history. He and a small crew sailed a captured ketch into the harbor disguised as a merchant vessel, boarded the Philadelphia, killed or scattered its Tripolitan guard, and set the ship on fire, escaping under gunfire from shore batteries without losing a man. The British Admiral Horatio Nelson is often quoted calling it the most bold and daring act of the age. It is a wonderful line, and it may well be genuine, but the sourcing for it is thin enough that historians treat it as attributed rather than confirmed, so hold it loosely. The land campaign that followed is stranger still. William Eaton, a former army officer turned diplomat, organized a march across 500 miles of desert from Alexandria, Egypt to the Tripolitan city of Derna in the spring of 1805, leading a patchwork force of a handful of United States Marines under Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon and several hundred Greek, Arab, and European mercenaries, all in support of the deposed brother of Tripoli's ruler. They took Derna. It is the campaign that put the words "to the shores of Tripoli" into the Marine Corps hymn. And then, just as Eaton was pushing toward a larger victory, American diplomats back on the coast negotiated a peace treaty that ended the war on terms that abandoned the whole operation, ransomed the remaining Philadelphia prisoners, and left Eaton furious for the rest of his life about a campaign he felt was won and then given away at the negotiating table. Morocco, worth a mention here, mostly stayed out of the fighting. The 1786 Treaty of Peace and Friendship signed with Morocco under the Articles of Confederation, negotiated in part by Thomas Barclay with the blessing of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, is still in force in some form today, and historians generally point to it as the longest unbroken treaty relationship in American history. It is a useful reminder that the story was never simply the United States against North Africa. It was 4 separate regencies with 4 separate rulers and 4 separate calculations about whether an American ship was worth more captured or left alone. Tribute did not fully end there. It took a second, shorter war in 1815, again led by Decatur, sailing into the Mediterranean with a squadron built by a country that finally had the ships to back its demands. He forced a new treaty on Algiers within weeks, one that ended tribute payments outright and secured compensation for American losses, then sailed on to extract similar terms from Tunis and Tripoli before the year was out. Payments that had once eaten a fifth of the federal budget simply stopped, more than 3 decades after they started. By then, the country that had once begged for protection had a navy that could take what it wanted instead. It is a tidy ending, the kind that makes for a good title card. What it skips over is everything happening back home in the meantime. Because while Decatur was making his name in the Mediterranean, the man who had come within one vote of the presidency was busy dismantling his own career in a way no one has fully explained since. He had already killed the most famous financier in the country on a ledge above the Hudson. That was somehow not the strangest thing he would do. Aaron Burr had been a war hero, a senator, and by most accounts one of the sharper legal minds in New York, and none of that had ever been enough to satisfy him. By 1801, he had the second most powerful job in the country, and almost no power to go with it. He was vice president under a man, Thomas Jefferson, who did not trust him, presiding over a Senate that mostly ignored him, sidelined from his own party after the Electoral College mess that had tied him with Jefferson the year before. So Burr did what an ambitious man with nowhere to go does. He ran for governor of New York in 1804, hoping to rebuild a base of his own. He lost badly, and he blamed the loss partly on one man who had spent nearly 2 decades making sure Burr never got anywhere near real power. That man was Alexander Hamilton. The Hamilton feud was old by then, running back through New York legal circles and party politics for years. Two brilliant, prickly men who could not stand each other and never missed a chance to say so. What finally lit the fuse was a newspaper letter. A doctor named Charles Cooper wrote to the Albany Register describing a dinner where Hamilton had allegedly voiced, in Cooper's words, a still more despicable opinion of Burr than anything already on the record. Burr wanted to know exactly what that despicable opinion was. Hamilton, through several rounds of increasingly stiff letters, declined to say, or rather insisted he could not recall the specifics closely enough to either confirm or deny them in the way Burr demanded. Neither man would back down from the correspondence, and correspondence like that, between two men of that era and that temperament, tended to end in one place. It ended at Weehawken, New Jersey, on the morning of July 11, 1804, on a rocky ledge above the Hudson River that had already hosted a dozen or so duels, including one that killed Hamilton's own eldest son 3 years earlier. Burr, the sitting vice president of the United States, stood across from the former Secretary of the Treasury with pistols. Hamilton was mortally wounded and died the next day. What actually happened in the seconds between the two shots is genuinely disputed and has been since the moment it happened. Hamilton's allies claimed he fired first, deliberately into the air, honoring a private vow against firing to kill. Burr's allies disputed the sequence entirely and pointed out that a shot fired to miss does not usually clip a tree branch well above and behind the other man, which is roughly where witnesses found Hamilton's ball. The 2 seconds present, positioned with their backs turned as etiquette demanded, gave conflicting accounts, and no version has ever been proven beyond doubt. Burr was indicted for murder in both New York and New Jersey and never stood trial for it in either state, quietly finishing out his term as vice president, presiding over the Senate with his usual composure, while his political career in the East finished right along with it. What Burr did next is where the story stops being merely dramatic and starts being genuinely uncertain. Between 1805 and 1807, he traveled extensively through the Western territories, gathering money, men, and boats, much of it staged from Blennerhassett Island, a private estate on the Ohio River. He corresponded closely with General James Wilkinson, the senior commander of the United States Army in the West, a man who was, at the same time, a secretly paid agent of the Spanish crown, a fact that would not become fully documented until long after both men were dead. What exactly Burr was planning has never been settled. The most serious accusation was that he intended to detach Western states from the Union and build a new country around himself. Other evidence points toward an invasion of Spanish territory in Mexico. Still other evidence suggests something far less dramatic, a legitimate land colonization venture on a tract Burr had leased in the Louisiana Territory. Historians still argue about which of these, if any, was the real plan, and the honest answer is that the surviving record does not resolve it. Harmon Blennerhassett, the Irish gentleman whose island estate had hosted the boats and provisions, seems to have believed sincerely in whichever version of the plan Burr had described to him, and he lost his fortune and his home for it when authorities seized the island in early 1807. Wilkinson resolved his own exposure the only way a man that compromised could. He turned on Burr first, sending Jefferson a cipher letter implicating his former partner, while conveniently editing out the passages that would have exposed his own Spanish payroll. Jefferson, already convinced, told Congress Burr's guilt was beyond question before any trial had taken place, a declaration that put the sitting president publicly and personally at odds with the man about to preside over that trial. That man was Chief Justice John Marshall, who opened proceedings in Richmond in the summer of 1807, riding circuit as federal judges of that era still did. The Constitution defines treason narrowly and deliberately, requiring either a confession in open court or the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act of levying war, a standard the framers built in specifically to prevent treason charges from becoming a tool against ordinary political opponents. Marshall held the prosecution to that standard with a rigor that infuriated Jefferson, ruling that prosecutors had failed to place Burr himself at the scene of any armed assembly, and that testimony about intentions and conversations, however damning it sounded, did not amount to a witnessed overt act. Burr was acquitted. He spent much of the rest of his life abroad, in debt and largely out of American public life, a man remembered less for a single proven crime than for a permanent, unresolved question mark hanging over everything he touched after Weehawken. And 1,000 miles northeast, another group of Americans was about to raise a question mark of its own, this one over whether New England intended to stay in the Union at all. By the winter of 1814, New England had had enough. The War of 1812 had strangled its shipping economy exactly the way Jefferson's embargo had strangled it years before, and the region's merchants, who depended on trade with Britain more than almost anyone else in the country, were watching their livelihoods sink along with their ships. British warships blockaded the coast, raided towns in Maine and Massachusetts, and the federal government in Washington seemed, from a New England parlor, to be fighting a war for the benefit of the South and West while leaving the Northeast to pay for it and defend itself. Some New England states had gone as far as refusing to hand their militias over for federal service, treating the war effort more like a suggestion than an obligation, and a faction of hardline Federalists known informally as the Essex Junto had been muttering about a separate Northern Confederacy since before the war even started. So in December of that year, 26 delegates gathered in Hartford, Connecticut, sent officially by the state governments of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and unofficially by sympathetic counties in New Hampshire and Vermont, whose own state governments declined to send delegations at all. The doors were closed, no press, no public record of the debates, just 3 weeks of quiet meetings in a plain brick statehouse that the rest of the country could only guess about. What people guessed, largely, was secession, and it is easy to see why. Talk of New England leaving the Union had circulated in Federalist circles for a decade already, ever since the embargo years, some of it serious enough that Aaron Burr himself had reportedly been approached about leading a Northern Confederacy back when he ran for New York governor. Closing the doors on a meeting like this practically invited the worst assumption. But what the delegates actually produced, when the report finally became public in January, was considerably tamer than the rumor. They proposed a set of constitutional amendments, and the 3/5 clause that let Southern states count enslaved people toward congressional representation without those people voting, a provision New England had resented since the founding because it inflated Southern power in Congress and in the Electoral College. Require a 2/3 supermajority in Congress before declaring war, admitting new states, or imposing an embargo. Limit presidents to a single term. Bar 2 consecutive presidents from the same state, a jab clearly aimed at Virginia's long grip on the office, since 3 of the first 4 presidents had come from there. It was a wish list for reshaping the Union's balance of power, not a plan for leaving it. The moderates ran the room, men like Harrison Gray Otis, who chaired the convention and later wrote its official report, understood exactly how close the whole enterprise sat to the edge of treason, and steered the final document away from anything that could be read as a vote to dissolve the Union. There is no record of a formal secession motion, no vote on it, nothing in the surviving minutes that crosses that line. Secession was discussed in New England that winter, openly in newspapers and parlors in state legislatures, by people who were not shy about the word, and a few of the more radical delegates arrived in Hartford, hoping the convention would go further than it ultimately did. But the convention itself, the actual body meeting behind those closed doors, stopped well short of it, and historians who have gone back through what survives of the debates generally agree the moderates kept those louder voices in check for all 3 weeks. The secrecy, though, did exactly what secrecy usually does. It let the worst version of the story fill in the blanks for everyone who was not in the room, and newspapers outside New England spent the winter printing exactly that worst version. Then came the timing, which is the part of this story that does the convention in more than anything the delegates actually wrote. 3 commissioners were sent from Hartford to Washington to present the resolutions and negotiate on New England's behalf, arriving in the capital in February 1815. They walked into a city celebrating 2 pieces of news that had landed within days of each other. Andrew Jackson had crushed the British at New Orleans on January 8, a lopsided, thrilling victory that made the war suddenly look winnable and worth having fought. And word had just arrived that a peace treaty, signed at Ghent back in December, had already ended the war entirely, weeks before Jackson's battle even happened. The commissioners' grievances, so carefully worded and so seriously intended, arrived in a city that no longer had a war to complain about and a great victory to celebrate instead. They were not received, they were barely acknowledged. They went home. The political damage was immediate and permanent. A party that had just spent a winter debating constitutional limits on the presidency behind locked doors, at the exact moment the country was celebrating a stunning military win, looked less like a principled opposition and more like a group that had bet against the nation and lost. The Federalist Party never recovered nationally. Within a handful of years it had effectively ceased to exist as a serious force in American politics, and the label of near treason attached itself to Hartford for generations, fairly or not. It is a strange kind of ending for a story that started with the burning of the nation's own capital only a few months before the delegates ever sat down. When British troops walked into Washington and set fire to the very buildings this argument over the country's future was technically about. It's August 1814, and the President of the United States is standing in a field near Bladensburg, Maryland, watching his own army fall apart in real time. James Madison had ridden out that morning to observe the defense of the Capitol, and at some point during the battle he ended up close enough to the fighting that British muskets were, technically, aimed in his general direction. No other sitting president has been on a battlefield under enemy fire quite like that, before or since. It did not go well. The American militia, badly outnumbered in experience if not in raw numbers, broke and ran so fast and so far that people started calling it the Bladensburg races. Soldiers didn't stop running until they'd passed straight through Washington and kept going. Madison, to his credit, got out ahead of the crowd, though not by much. The British had landed days earlier at Benedict, Maryland, marched inland almost entirely unopposed, and by the time they reached the outskirts of Washington there was barely an army left standing between them and the capital. With the road wide open, forces under Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn walked into an American capital city for the first and only time in the nation's history. They didn't loot it, not really, they burned it, deliberately and methodically, as retaliation for earlier American burning of the Canadian legislature at York. The Capitol went up, the President's house went up, its interior gutted, leaving only the scorched stone shell that later got a coat of white paint to cover the char, which is one theory, disputed by some historians, for why it became the White House. The Treasury burned, and the Navy Yard burned too, though the British didn't get credit for that one. American officers torched it themselves rather than let the British take the ships and supplies stored there. Sometimes the enemy doesn't even have to finish the job. Cockburn, by most accounts, treated the whole affair with a kind of theatrical relish. He reportedly walked into the empty House chamber, took the Speaker's seat, and put a mock question to the room, asking whether the assembled British officers thought the building should be burned, then declaring the ayes had it. Not every building fell to the flames, though. The Patent Office survived because its superintendent, William Thornton, who had also drawn the Capitol's original design, personally intervened with British officers on site and argued that the models and records stored there were private property belonging to individual inventors, not government assets, and therefore not a legitimate target. It apparently worked. It's a strange footnote that the one government office spared that night was saved by an argument about intellectual property. Dolly Madison's evacuation of the president's house has become one of those stories that grows a little in the retelling, so it's worth being precise about who actually did what. Dolly did stay behind past the point of comfort, refusing to leave until she'd secured what she considered essential, and she gets deserved credit for the decision. But the physical work, prying a large portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart out of its frame because there wasn't time to unscrew it properly, hauling it out the door before the British arrived. That labor was done by other people in the house. An enslaved manservant named Paul Jennings was there. So was the French-born doorkeeper Jean-Pierre Siusat, and a gardener named Thomas McGraw. The three of them got the painting out. Jennings was 15 at the time, still enslaved to Madison, and decades later, after eventually gaining his freedom, he wrote about that day and much else from his years in the household. Historians often call it the first White House memoir, and it's a strange thing to sit with, that the fullest first-hand account of a president's household came from a man that household did not consider free. Meanwhile, across town, a State Department clerk named Stephen Pleasanton was doing his own quiet version of the same job. Pleasanton had the presence of mind to gather the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and other irreplaceable government papers, stuff them into linen sacks, and cart them out of the city before the British arrived. No portraits, no drama, just a government clerk deciding that paper mattered more than furniture. Then the city got a second disaster it did not order. The day after the burning, a storm rolled in that some accounts describe as an actual tornado, tearing roofs off buildings, uprooting trees, and by some tellings doing more damage to British-held positions than the American militia had managed the day before. It also conveniently helped douse some of the fires. Nature, for once, seemed to be taking a side, though it's just as likely it was simply August in the mid-Atlantic, doing what August in the mid-Atlantic sometimes does. Among the buildings lost was the Library of Congress, then housed inside the Capitol, its shelves and collection reduced to ash along with everything else. Thomas Jefferson, retired to Monticello, and in some financial difficulty of his own, offered Congress his personal library as a replacement. Nearly 6,500 volumes he had spent a lifetime assembling on subjects far beyond law and politics, including philosophy, science, and literature in several languages. Congress debated the price and the propriety of it, since some members thought Jefferson's collection a little too broad and a little too French for a government library, but they bought it anyway, for close to $24,000. That purchase became the seed of the modern Library of Congress, which means the institution's core, to this day, still carries the shape of one man's curiosity. In the weeks after the fires, there was even serious talk in Congress of abandoning Washington altogether and moving the capital somewhere less exposed, somewhere inland and harder for a navy to reach. The idea got debated and, in the end, narrowly rejected. Washington rebuilt where it stood. The scorch marks got painted over. New sessions of Congress met in temporary quarters while the Capitol was reconstructed, and within a few years you could stand on the same ground and not know a foreign army had ever walked through singing while the sky turned orange. The country moved on the way it usually does, by simply not looking back too hard. But the sky itself wasn't finished with surprises. 2 years later, something happened to the weather across the entire northern half of the world, and almost nobody at the time had any idea why. In April of 1815, a mountain on the island of Sumbawa, in what was then the Dutch East Indies, tore itself apart. Mount Tambora's eruption is still, by most measures, the largest volcanic event in recorded history, dwarfing anything Europe or the Americas had on record. It killed tens of thousands of people locally, through the blast itself, the ash that buried whole villages, and the famine and disease that followed on the surrounding islands in the months after, with death toll estimates that run past 70,000 once you count all of that together. And then it did something slower and stranger, something nobody anywhere could have watched happen. It threw enough sulfate particles into the upper atmosphere to form a fine veil around the planet, reflecting sunlight back into space and cooling the northern hemisphere for more than a year afterward. Nobody down on the ground could see the veil. They just felt what it did, and in some places they saw its edges, painters as far away as Europe recording unusually vivid, layered sunsets through skies thick with high-altitude haze they had no name for. What it did, in New England, was cancel summer. In June of 1816, snow fell in Vermont and upstate New York. Not a freak flurry, but real accumulating snow in June. Frost came back again in July. It came back in August. Farmers who had planted corn in the spring watched it die in the field, sometimes more than once, as they replanted after each killing frost only to lose the next planting too. Hay and grain already thin got expensive fast, expensive enough that families who had livestock they could no longer feed simply slaughtered the animals, rather than watch them starve slowly through a winter that arrived early and never really left. People started calling it 1800 and froze to death, a joke with real hunger sitting underneath it. The practical result was one of the larger internal migrations in early American history. Thousands of New England families, looking at ruined fields and thin livestock, decided the answer wasn't to wait out one more bad harvest. It was to leave. They packed up and moved west, into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, chasing land that hadn't just failed them. Whole townships in parts of New England lost a meaningful share of their population within a couple of years. Among the families who left around this time was a farming household from Sharon, Vermont, the Smiths, who relocated to western New York in the years after the failed harvests looking for steadier ground. A small, unremarkable relocation at the time that would later matter a great deal to American religious history. It's one of those quiet demographic facts that doesn't get its own chapter in most textbooks, even though it helped fill out the Midwest a full generation earlier than it might have otherwise happened. New England wasn't alone, and in some ways it got off easy. Crop failures rippled across much of Europe too, where the end of the Napoleonic Wars had already left economies strained, and food riots and outright famine hit parts of Switzerland, Germany, and Ireland especially hard. Monsoon patterns shifted across Asia, and some historians connect the disrupted rains in the Bengal region that year to conditions that helped a new strain of cholera begin its spread, the start of a pandemic that would eventually reach far beyond South Asia. A single eruption, half a world away from any of these places, had reached into harvests and rainfall on nearly every populated continent. People at the time reached for whatever explanation their science could offer, and mostly it wasn't much. Newspapers floated theories about unusual sunspot activity dimming the sun. Preachers in some pulpits treated the ruined summer as a form of divine warning. A few, more practically minded, simply chalked it up to an unlucky run of weather and started planning how to survive the winter that followed, which came early and hit a population already short on stored food. It also, almost as a side effect, helped produce a novel. That same cold, wet, miserable summer of 1816 kept a group of friends indoors at a villa on Lake Geneva, unable to do much of the boating and hiking they'd planned. Lord Byron was there, along with Percy Shelley, Mary Godwin, who was not yet Mary Shelley, and John Polidori. Trapped by weather with nothing better to do, Byron proposed they each write a ghost story. Mary Shelley's contribution eventually grew into Frankenstein. Polidori's became the vampire, arguably the ancestor of the modern literary vampire. Neither of them nor anyone else in that room had any reason to connect the rain outside to a mountain that had exploded on the other side of the planet the year before. Byron's own contribution to that same gathering, a fragment of vampire fiction he abandoned partway through, ended up handed to his personal physician, Polidori, who finished the idea in his own words and published it under his own name a few years later. Two lasting horror archetypes, born the same damp week, out of a summer with no proper summer in it. And that's really the strange part worth sitting with. Nobody at the time made the connection between the ruined harvests, the June snow, the food riots in Europe, and a volcano in the Dutch East Indies. There was no way for them to make it. The idea that a single eruption could reach around the globe and dim the sun for a season wasn't something science could establish until well over a century later, when researchers went back through old weather records, tree rings, and volcanic records and started connecting the dots. People in 1816 just lived through a ruined year and called it bad luck, or judgment, or simply the will of God, because that was the only vocabulary available to them. It would take modern climatology to hand them, long after they were gone, the actual explanation. 10 years after that ruined summer, in a small town in western New York, a different kind of disappearance was about to unsettle the country in an entirely different way, one with no volcano to blame and no tidy explanation at all. In the small town of Batavia, New York, a stonemason named William Morgan announced, sometime in 1826, that he intended to publish a book. Not a novel, not a memoir, but an exposé of the secret rituals and passwords of Freemasonry, an organization Morgan had reportedly once belonged to and had since fallen out with. He'd found a local printer, David Miller, willing to publish it, and word of the project spread through local lodges fast, well before a single copy existed. It did not go over well. Within weeks, Morgan found himself arrested, first on a minor debt claim and then on a charge of petty theft involving a shirt and tie he'd supposedly borrowed and not returned, the kind of legal trouble that tends to look, in hindsight, suspiciously convenient. In September 1826, a group of men removed Morgan from the jail where he was being held, ostensibly to settle the debt claim on his behalf. He was then reportedly transported by carriage through a relay of waiting parties toward Fort Niagara, on the border with Canada, passed from one set of hands to the next along the way. And then he was simply gone. No trial, no confirmed grave, no last confirmed sighting anyone could agree on. It's worth being careful here, because the popular version of this story tends to state flatly that the Masons murdered him, and the honest answer is that nobody has ever been able to prove that. One persistent account held that he was drowned in the Niagara River with weights attached, but that account rests on second-hand testimony given years afterward, not on physical evidence. A body did wash ashore on Lake Ontario roughly a year later, and it briefly seemed like the mystery might resolve itself, but the identification became its own controversy. Different parties looked at the same remains and reached different conclusions, with Morgan's own widow initially identifying certain features as her husband's, while another family, separately and just as insistently, identified the same remains as a Canadian man named Timothy Monroe, who had drowned around the same time. The case against the men eventually brought to trial only produced convictions for conspiracy to kidnap, not murder, and the sentences handed down were short, a matter of months to about 2 years in most cases. William Morgan's actual fate has never been conclusively established, and it remains to this day genuinely unresolved. What the disappearance did settle, decisively, was public opinion. Whatever happened to Morgan, the visible facts were bad enough on their own. A man with plans to publish embarrassing information had been arrested on flimsy pretenses, extracted from custody by a group with lodge connections, and then vanished, all while investigators, prosecutors, and even some judges involved in the case turned out to have Masonic ties of their own. To a lot of ordinary Americans watching from outside that network, it looked less like a fraternal club and more like a closed system that could reach into courthouses and sheriff's offices whenever it needed to protect its own. A line sometimes attributed to the newspaper editor Thurlow Weed, about one contested body being good enough to call Morgan until after the next election, gets repeated often enough in tellings of this story that it's worth flagging plainly, since historians are not confident he actually said it. True or not, it captures how cynical the public mood around the case had become. Lodges across the Northeast saw a wave of resignations in the years that followed, tens of thousands of members by some counts, as men who wanted no part of that impression walked away. Out of that anger came something genuinely new in American politics, the Anti-Masonic Party. It's easy to hear that name now and picture a fringe curiosity, a group organized around a single grievance, and it started out looking exactly like that. But it grew fast, especially in New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont, and it became, by most accounts, the first significant third party in the country's history, winning local and state offices and putting real pressure on establishment politicians who had never had to answer to an organized opposition built entirely from outside the existing parties. Its more lasting legacy, though, wasn't at the ballot box. In September 1831, meeting in Baltimore, the Anti-Masonic Party held the first national nominating convention in American history, a formal gathering of delegates from around the country to choose a presidential candidate, William Wirt, complete with a written party platform laying out what the party stood for. Both practices, the convention and the platform, were adopted almost immediately by the two major parties and are still in their basic shape how American presidential nominees get chosen today. Wirt's own run the following year won only Vermont, a modest showing, but the mechanics the party had invented to get him there outlived the campaign by more than a century and a half. A party remembered mostly for a conspiracy scare left behind the actual scaffolding of the system that replaced it. The Anti-Masonic Party itself didn't last much longer than a decade or so as an independent force. By the early 1830s, most of its energy and many of its members had been absorbed into the newly forming Whig Party, which found the anti-Masons' organizing skill and their base of suspicious, engaged voters useful enough to fold in wholesale. Several politicians who cut their teeth in anti-Masonic organizing, including a young New Yorker named William Seward, carried that experience straight into Whig and later Republican politics for decades afterward. The party that started as an answer to one vanished stonemason ended up quietly reshaping how every American election since has been run. Just over a decade later, a very different kind of disappearance and reappearance would grip the country's attention again. This one involving not a missing man on a country road, but a ship drifting off the coast of Long Island with a story on board that would eventually reach the Supreme Court. In the summer of 1839, a Spanish schooner called La Amistad was making a short coastal run in Cuban waters, carrying a cargo the ship's papers described as slaves already legally held on the island. That description was false. The people aboard were Mende men, women and children who had been captured in what is now Sierra Leone, marched to the coast, and forced across the Atlantic on a slave ship called the Tacora in direct violation of treaties Spain itself had signed banning the trade. Many of the roughly 500 people crammed aboard that crossing did not survive it. The ones who did were landed in Cuba and given false paperwork identifying them as Ladinos, meaning slaves already long held on the island rather than recent illegal captives, a paperwork fiction designed to slide past Spanish and British patrols watching for exactly this kind of shipment. They were then sold to two Spanish planters, Pedro Montes and Jose Ruiz, who loaded them onto the Amistad for a short coastal run to another part of Cuba. Somewhere off the Cuban coast, one of the captives, a man named Sengbe Pa, worked a loose nail free from the ship's timbers, used it to pick the lock on the shackles, and led the others in a revolt. In the fighting that followed, the ship's captain and its cook were killed, along with one or two of the captives. Sengbe Pa, who would become known in the United States by the name Joseph Cinque, ordered the surviving Spaniards spared on the condition that they sail the ship back to Africa. The Spaniards agreed, and then spent the following weeks quietly deceiving their captors, steering east by day when they were watched closely, and turning the ship north and west by night, slowly working their way up the American coast instead. For nearly 2 months, the Amistad drifted and zigzagged along the eastern seaboard, its food and water running low, occasionally putting ashore in small parties to trade for supplies, which only fed rumors up and down the coast about a mysterious ship crewed by Africans. By late August, the schooner, its rigging in disrepair and its passengers desperate, was spotted off the coast of Long Island and boarded by the crew of the USS Washington, a naval vessel that took the ship into custody and brought it into New London, Connecticut. What followed was not, at first, a case about the morality of slavery in any broad sense. The legal question the courts actually had to answer was narrower, and in its own way more revealing. It concerned property and treaty obligations, and whether these particular people had ever been legally enslaved at all under existing international agreements. Adding to the tangle, the naval officer who had seized the ship filed his own claim for salvage rights, arguing the vessel and everyone aboard it counted as recovered property he was owed a share of, which meant the court had competing property claims to sort through even before it reached the deeper question. If the captives had been captured and transported in violation of the treaties banning the trade, then Spain had no valid property claim to assert in the first place, whatever the falsified paperwork said. The Van Buren administration, weighing an upcoming election and eager not to antagonize Spain or Southern political support, sided firmly with the claim that the Africans should simply be handed back as Spanish property, no trial of the underlying facts required, and reportedly had a naval vessel standing by in New London harbor ready to spirit the captives out of the country before any appeal could be heard. By this point, a small committee of abolitionists and other supporters in the Northeast had organized to fund the captives' legal defense, hired translators who could actually communicate with men who spoke no English and no Spanish, and coordinate the growing public interest in the case. The district court disagreed with the administration's position. Judge Andrew Judson ruled that the Mende captives had been kidnapped and illegally transported, that they had never been lawful property under Spanish or international law, and that they were free to return home. The Van Buren administration, unwilling to accept that outcome, pushed the case forward on appeal, and by 1841 it had reached the Supreme Court. There, the captives found an unusual advocate. Roger Sherman Baldwin, an experienced Connecticut attorney, had argued the case at the lower levels and continued on appeal, and he was joined before the Supreme Court by John Quincy Adams, 73 years old, a former president then serving as a sitting member of Congress, who agreed to argue the case as well, and did so at extraordinary length, reportedly speaking for several hours across more than one day, laying out the treaty law and the moral stakes together. Justice Joseph Story wrote the court's opinion, affirming that the captives had never been legal slaves, had a natural right to resist unlawful captivity, and were free. In 1842, the surviving members of the group made the journey back to Sierra Leone, funded in part by American abolitionist and missionary supporters who had rallied to their cause during the trial. It would be comforting to end the story there, with a clean homecoming, but the honest version is less tidy. The place they returned to had changed in the years they were gone, and the historical record of what became of most of them afterward is thin and scattered, pieced together from missionary letters and fragments rather than any complete account. Some stayed connected to the missionaries who had helped fund their return. Others simply disappear from the written record, the way so many people from this period do, regardless of how loudly history briefly noticed them. And that in its way is a fitting place to end this whole story. Nothing about the country's early decades unfolded the way the tidy version taught in classrooms suggests. It was improvised at almost every turn, contested by the people living through it, and closer to falling apart than most retellings ever let on. The textbook version smooths all of that into a straight line towards something inevitable. The actual record, read closely, never quite behaves that way at all.